Hi, this is Mrs. Chavez. Today we're starting chapter 34. We're going to look at the Great Depression, the great economic downturn that took place after World War I. So the Great War discredited the established social and political institutions and long-held beliefs about the superiority of European society. It was over. Writers, poets, theologians, and other intellectuals lamented the decline and their and the imminent death of their high society. While some wrote obituaries, others, however, embarked on a new and bold cultural path that established the main tendencies of contemporary thought and taste, the ones that we're used to today. Most of these cultural innovators began their work before the war, but it was in those 2 decades following the war that revolution in science, psychology, art, architecture attained its fullest development and potential. We're going to be looking at the beginnings of many of those adventures today. After the horrors and debilitating upheavals of the Great War, much of the world yearned for a return to normalcy and prosperity. By the early 1920s, the efforts of the governments and businesses to rebuild their damaged economies seemed to be coming quite along, but prosperity was short-lived. In 1929, the world plunged into an economic depression that was so long-lasting, so severe, and so global that it's become known as the Great Depression. The old capitalist system of trade and finance collapsed until a new system took its place after 1945. A return to worldwide prosperity couldn't have occurred. There were new visions in physics. The discoveries of the physicists undermined the Newtonian universe, in which a set of inexorably natural laws governed events, with a new and disturbing cosmos. Uncertainty governed the strange universe, which lacked objective reality. Whereas the things were predictable in the past and were fixed in Newton's universe, Albert Einstein's scientific theories opened up the world to multiple conflicting realities and perceptions that were actually more democratic. Equally discomforting were the insights of psychoanalysis that suggested that human behavior was fundamentally irrational, and disquieting trends in the arts paralleled the developments in science and psychology, especially in painting. An aversion to realism and a pronounced preference for abstraction heralded the arrival of the new aesthetic standards. Freud's work with World War I combat veterans marked an unprecedented turn in his understanding of dreams and trauma as his focus on the individual, who's transformed into a study of community and a collective unconscious. The war not only had professional but personal implications for him. His 2 sons, John Martin and Ernst, fought for Austria, a country that almost 20 years later forced Freud, a Jew, and his family into exile when the Nazis took over. 3 of his 4 sisters died in concentration camps during World War II. Freud begins his groundbreaking work Beyond the Pleasure Principle with his astonished encounter with the veterans of World War I, whose dreams of the battlefield bring them back repeatedly to the horrifying scenes of death that they'd witnessed. Like the victims of an accident, neuroses, these dreams seem to bring the soldiers back to the moment of fright or surprise that constituted their original encounter with death. People suffering from accident neurosis is what they call it. We call it post-traumatic distress today. And war neurosis have dreams that demonstrate a pathological condition which involves the repetitive intrusion of nightmares and reliving of the battlefield events, whose symptoms seem to reflect in startling directness and simplicity nothing but the unmediated occurrence of violence. Let's look at some experimentation in art. Along with the millions of idealistic young men who were cut to pieces by machine guns and obliterated by artillery shells, there was another major casualty of World War I, and that was traditional ideas about Western art. The Great War of 1914 tilted culture on its axis, particularly in Europe and the United States. It created an epoch in art called modernism, a term with a wide range of new sensibilities and aesthetic responses to the industrial age. Modernism took shape decades before World War I, but its arrival was vastly accelerated by the greatest collective trauma in history up to that point. When war broke out in summer of 1914, artists were among its biggest cheerleaders. Britain and France, Europe, dominant 19th century military and cultural powers saw the war as necessary for reinforcing the continental status quo, while Germany viewed it as an opportunity for purging Europe of political stagnancy and cultural malaise. That quickly changed after the war started, when the artists were drawn into the dark realities of the war, exploring realism in terms of trenches and death. Artists explored dimensions of color, line, and shape rather than realistic images. They shunned the realistic. Artists returned to classical traditions, and they adapted antiquity to the modern world. And that brings us up to the Great Depression. The modern world has never experienced an economic crisis as severe as the Great Depression. The term was first coined in the United States to describe the economic collapse that by 1931 had shattered the U.S. economy and Americans' faith in the future. Europe and the rest of the world were also badly hit, and while they first called the crisis a slump, in time the label Great Depression was adopted on both sides of the Atlantic to describe this unprecedented global economic crisis. Although there were national variations, no part of Europe was left untouched by the Great Depression. In its worst affected countries, Poland, Germany, and Austria, 1 in 5 of the population was unemployed, and industrial output fell by over 40%. Levels of trade between countries also collapsed. By 1932, the value of European trade had fallen to 1/3 of its value in 1929. While many of Europe's most respected banking houses and currencies teetered on the brink of collapse. By the end of the decade, some semblance of recovery had been achieved, but it was neither complete nor sustained. If preparations for another war had not generated demand and investment, it is very likely that the world would have entered a new Great Depression after 1937. New technology that came about during the Great Depression and during the 1930s, we're going to start with agriculture first. Agricultural engineers adapted new technologies from other industries and invented many of their own. For example, advances in steel manufacturing meant that there was stronger and cheaper steel available. So before the 30s, many of the farm implements were made primarily out of wood with steel mounted in them. During the 30s, more and more farm implements were built completely from steel. Tractor manufacturing borrowed from car and truck technology. Beginning in 1932, rubber tires began replacing the steel lug tires that had been on the tractors. Later in the decade, tractors were built with diesel engines. Fuel technology was getting better. Up until 1933, gasoline was sold by gravity rather than by the power it produced. Today, consumers are used to choosing between 87, 89, and 91 octane rated gas. But it was not until 1933 that oil companies began adding anti-knock chemicals to their fuels and marketing gasoline on its octane rating. The additives brought the octane ratings up from 50 or 60 to 70 octane gas. Tractor manufacturers then brought out new models specifically designed to use the new, more powerful fuels. Yet despite new technologies, farmers relied on tried and true technologies as well. For instance, new tractors would plow up the fence rows that were often made from native tree limbs. The first electric razor came about in the 1930s. The first car radio came about in the 1930s. The first copy machine, the Xerox copy machine, came out in the 1930s. The modern tampon came out in the 1930s. Chocolate chip cookies, 1933. And the very first supermarket that we know about, called King Cullen, came out in 1930. So the farmers and the Great Depression. The farmers struggled with low prices all through the 1920s, but after 1929, things began to be hard for city workers as well. After the stock market crash, many businesses started to close or to lay off workers, and many families didn't have money to buy things, and the consumer demand for manufactured goods fell off. Fewer families were buying new cars or household appliances. People learned to do without new clothing. Many families couldn't even pay their rent. Some young men just left home by jumping on the railroad cars in search of any job they could get. Some wondered if the United States was heading for a revolution. During World War I, the farmers worked really hard to produce record crops and livestock because it was needed. And when the prices fell, they tried to produce even more to pay their debts, taxes, and living expenses. In the early 1930s, prices dropped so low that many farmers went bankrupt and lost their farms. In some cases, the price of a bushel of corn fell to just 8 or 10 cents. Some farm families began burning corn rather than coal in their stoves because corn was cheaper. Sometimes the countryside smelled like popcorn from all the corn burning in the kitchen stoves. Some farmers became angry and wanted the government to step in and keep farm families in their homes. In Iowa, a mob of angry farmers burst into the courtroom and pulled out the judge from the bench. They carried him out of the courtroom, drove him out of town, and tried to make him promise that he would not take any more cases that would cost a farm family its farm. When he refused, they threatened to hang him. Fortunately, the gang broke up, and they left the judge in kind of a dazed condition. The governor of Iowa called out the National Guard, who rounded up some of the leaders of the mob and put them all in jail. So the federal government passed a bill to help the farmers. Surplus was the problem. Farmers were producing too much and having to bring the prices down because of it. The government passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA of 1933, and that set limits on the size of the crops and the herds farmers could produce. These farmers agreed to the limit of production and were paid a subsidy. Most farmers signed up, and soon the government checks were flowing into the mailboxes, and where the money could help pay their bank debts and their tax payments and things like that. It was the stock market crash of 1929. It was considered the worst economic event in world history. It began on Thursday, October 24th, 1929, when investors trading a record 12.9 million shares. On October 28th, dubbed Black Monday, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged nearly 13%. The market fell another 12% the next day, called Black Tuesday. Now, while the crisis sent shockwaves across the financial world, there were numerous signs that a stock market crash was coming anyway. A stock market peak had occurred before the crash. During the Roaring '20s, the U.S. economy and the stock market experienced expansion, and stocks hit record highs. The Dow increased sixfold from August 1921 to September 1929, leading economists to conclude that stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. The market officially peaked on September 3rd, 1929, when the Dow shot up to 381. By this time, many ordinary working-class citizens had become interested in stock investments, and some purchased stocks on margin, meaning they paid only a small percentage of the value and borrowed the rest from a bank or a broker. The market and the public were overconfident. Some experts argue that at the time of the crash, stocks were widely overpriced and that a collapse was imminent. That same sense of recklessness and overconfidence extended to average consumers and small investors too, leading to an asset bubble. The crash happened after a long period of rising market growth that led to consumer overconfidence. In fact, after 1922, the stock market had increased by nearly 20% each year until 1929. So people bought stocks with easy credit. During the 1920s, there was a rapid growth in the bank credit, and they were able to acquire loans easily. People were encouraged by the market stability and were unafraid of debt. The concept of buying on margin allowed ordinary people with very little financial acumen to borrow money from their stockbrokers and put down as little as 10% of the share value. A similar type of overconfidence was seen in industries, such as manufacturing and agriculture. Overproduction led to a glut of items, including farm crops, steel, durable goods, and iron. This meant companies had to purge their supplies at a loss, and share prices suffered. The government raised interest rates in August 1929, just weeks before the stock market crashed. The Federal Reserve of New York raised the interest rate from 5% to 6%. Some experts said this steep, sudden hike in the interest rate cooled investors' enthusiasm, which affected market stability and sharply reduced economic growth. Another factor was going on: agricultural recession. Farmers struggled to make an annual profit to keep their businesses afloat. Some believe this agricultural slump affected the financial climate of the country. After the crash, panic made a bad situation even worse. Public banks in the days after the stock market crashed led to hordes of people rushing to banks to withdraw their funds in a number of what they call bank runs, and investors were unable to return their money because bank officials had invested the money in the market. This led to massive bank failures and actually deepened an already dire financial situation. Now, many analysts claim that the financial press also played a key role and contributed to the sense of panic that exacerbated the stock market crash. The day before Black Thursday, the Washington Post ran the headline, "Huge selling wave creates near panic as stocks collapse," while the New York Times announced prices of stocks crash in heavy liquidation. There was no single cause for the turmoil. Most economists agree that several compounding factors led to the stock market crash of 1929. A soaring, overheated economy that was destined to one day fall likely played the largest role. Equally relevant were issues such as overpriced shares, public panic, rising bank loads, and an agricultural crisis, higher interest rates, and a cynical press adding to the disarray. Many investors and ordinary people lost their entire savings, while numerous banks and companies went bankrupt. While historians sometimes debate whether the stock market crash of 1929 directly caused the Great Depression, there's no doubt that it greatly affected the American economy for many years. After October 29, 1929, stock prices had nowhere to go but up, so there was considered a recovery during the succeeding weeks. Overall, however, prices continued to drop as the United States slumped into the Great Depression. And by 1932, stocks were worth only about 20% of their value from the summer of 1929. The stock market crash of 1929 was not the sole cause of the Great Depression, but it did act to accelerate the global economic collapse, of which it was also a symptom. By 1933, nearly half of America's banks had failed, and unemployment was approaching 15 million people, or 30% of the workforce. African Americans were particularly hit hard, as they were the last hired and first fired. Women during the Great Depression fared slightly better, as traditional female jobs of the era like teaching and nursing were more insulated than those dependent on fluctuating markets. Life for the average family during the Great Depression was difficult. Storms and severe drought in the southern plains ruined crops, causing the area to be nicknamed the Dust Bowl. Okies, as fleeing residents were called, moved to the big cities looking for work. By 1933, unemployment rates in Europe were soaring. Of the available workforce in each country, unemployment rates were 26.3% in Germany, 23.7% in Sweden, 14.1% in Britain, and 20.4% in Belgium, and 28.8% in Denmark. In France, social unrest was escalating, and the effects of unemployment, in addition to the rise of the Nazi Party in neighboring Germany, political leaders of the various nations were coming under increased pressure to adopt forceful policies to end the Depression. Seeking solutions to the world crisis, more than 60 nations met at the 1933 World Economic Conference in London. When cooperative international solutions proved futile and the conference collapsed, the world seemed sentenced to a prolonged economic depression. Each nation was largely left to recover on its own. Of even greater consequence to the world, the economic hardships of the Great Depression led to destabilization of European politics. The nations, one by one, led first by the United States and then Britain, turned inward to try to solve their problems apart from other nations. The lack of the economic and political cooperation fueled the growth of nationalism, and nationalism is when a country places its needs significantly over the interests of other nations. This trend had major effects for the world economy and for politics. Most notably, the National Socialist Party grew rapidly in Germany, bringing with it a new leader, Adolf Hitler. The global economic crisis and the world's poorly organized response to it, in part, led to the outbreak of World War II in Europe in 1939. In 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crash and the failure of important European banks plunged the entire world into economic depression, and Japan was also hit, especially hard. One way Japan could gain greater access to raw materials and markets was to increase the amount of territory under Japanese control, which is exactly what they set out to do. First, by attacking China, moving around the Southern Pacific area to conquer other lands in order to get resources. The Great Depression, which followed the U.S. stock market crash of 1929, also affected the countries of Latin America. Foreign investment in the country was reduced to zero. To keep the coffee prices from falling even more, the government ordered the dumping of thousands of coffee sacks into the ocean. Despair and government action. In President Hoover, Americans got the president they wanted, at least at first. He was a third in line of a free market Republican presidents elected to continue the policies that had served the economy so well. But when the stock market crashed in 1929 and the underlying weaknesses in the economy came to the fore, President Hoover did not act with clear intentionality and speed. His record as president will likely always bear the taint of his unwillingness to push through substantial government aid. But, despite that failing, his record is not without major accomplishments. Hoover's international policies, particularly in regard to Latin America, served the country very well. And while his attitude towards civil rights mirrored his conviction that the government intervention was a negative force, he did play a key role changing living conditions for Native Americans. In all, it was his and the country's bad luck that his presidency ultimately required a very different philosophy than the one that had gotten him elected. Economic experimentation. Well, the laissez-faire capitalist plan of scarcity failed. Okay, despite that happening, we had John Maynard Keynes. He was an economist, and he was an economist from 1883 to 1946, saw us through this crisis, saw us also through the crisis of World War II. And he believed that a Keynesian economy would stimulate by lowering interest rates and encouraging investment and employment. And then we got the New Deal. And despite his popularity, Roosevelt had significant critics. At the end of the first New Deal, some on the right felt that he had moved the country in a dangerous direction towards socialism and fascism, whereas others on the left felt that he had not gone far enough to help the still struggling American people. Reeling after the Supreme Court struck down two key pieces of New Deal legislation, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the NIRA, Roosevelt pushed Congress to pass a new wave of bills to provide jobs, banking reforms, and social safety net. The laws that emerged, the Banking Act, the Emergency Relief Appropriations Act, and the Social Security Act, still define our country today. Roosevelt won his second term in a landslide and continued to push for legislation that would help the economy. The jobs program employed over 8 million people, and while systematic discrimination hurt both women and African American workers, these programs were still successful in getting people back to work. The last major piece of the New Deal legislation that Roosevelt passed was the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set a minimum wage, established a maximum hour work week, and forbade child labor completely. This law, as well as the Social Security, still provides much of the social safety net in the United States today. While critics and historians continue to debate whether the New Deal ushered a permanent change to the political culture of the country, from one of individualism to the creation of the welfare state, none deny the fact that Roosevelt's presidency expanded the role of the federal government in all people's lives, generally for the better. Even if the most conservative of president's successors would question this commitment, the notion of some level of government involvement in economic regulation and social welfare had largely been stated by 1941. Future debates would be about the extent and the degree of that involvement.